So Ruth is suggesting that we begin this presentation, so I'm going to do that. Welcome to anyone who may be watching that I don't know about, and appreciate your being here. And I want to reiterate what I suggested before in the invitation video, which is that this is going to be a weekly Fridays at lunchtime hangout, and each week we'll have a topic for an idea that we want to discuss. And it's going to be very casual. Hopefully, there will always be kind of a central theme for what we're talking about, but you can bring your bag lunch, hang out here in the gallery, and we'll talk about it or log in. Since we now have the ability to present online in all these fantastic virtual ways, we'll continue to do so. Let me also say that we're counting on you to tell us if you can't hear something or if you can't see something and there's a glitch in the technology that we can't figure out, and we'll try to figure it out. So to get the series started, I thought of some ideas for topics that I could present. And the first one, which is something that I've been thinking about for a long time, is a conversation on the architecture of the modern era in Sherman. And this presentation is sponsored by Tom Kyle and Clayton Mahone at Texoma Financial Services. Actually, they're a Ghost Town sponsor, and they're the sponsor of this episode of this series. So we want to thank them for supporting Ghost Town and all of our programming. Okay, so I'm going to just dive into this and see where the conversation goes. Interject, any of you, anytime you have a question or thought or idea, or you think we need to elaborate or clarify anything. And I'll first tell you that when I put the topic idea down, I made it really broad. I think I said something like the good, the bad, and the ugly, and the modern architecture of Sherman. Well, that's a really, really big topic to try to cover if we were going to cover everything that might be included in that. So maybe this is a little narrower so that we can fit it into the time frame of a lunch hour. And maybe it's also going to be just a little bit more of the eccentricity of my personal observations, which hopefully will be interesting. And maybe we'll also find that some of what we talk about will inspire more in-depth look at other subtopics and subtopics. We'll have to draw an infographic to see if we can make that work. So let's see where we go. All right, so I want you to just take note of the introductory slide. Can anybody identify that or not? Do you have an idea of what we're looking at? Anyone? Anyone? Live or not?
Well, it was Texoma Savings, and then Grayson County State Bank, and later American Bank. And now it belongs to?
Now it belongs to Ray Beatty and Lynn Leatherwood, some friends of mine, ours. Good. So if you're like me, like I spend a lot of time looking at Google Earth to see things from the sky, which is a view that you don't normally get to see. And I think this is pretty fascinating when you think about the shape of the roof plane of that building and then look at it from the sky to understand how its structure works. See all those beams traversing each other, connecting the midpoints of these arcs. We'll talk more about that building in a little bit. So first, just to kind of frame the conversation, when we talk about modernism, modernism is a philosophical and cultural movement that was bigger than just architecture. And this is a Wikipedia definition that suggested, oh gosh, we're gonna have to figure out how to not have all of that covering up that screen. Oh, what if I push this? That's good enough, isn't it? So I can't see anybody anymore, but just talk. So this is the Wikipedia definition. So it says that the modernism as a philosophical art and cultural movement started in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And of course, it was coincident with the Industrial Revolution and major changes in society. So it's bigger than just architecture. And I wanted to frame it that way because one of the things I want to do as we talk about some individual buildings is put them in that larger context. So among the factors that shaped modernism, maybe I just said this, the development of modern industrial societies and the rapid growth of cities, followed later by reactions to World War I. And I think that's really big for American modernism, especially. So it reflected a departure from traditional forms of art, religion, philosophy, social organization, and daily life, which modernist artists felt had become outdated in the new environments of an emerging industrialized world. So basically, in terms of architecture, the world we're living in is changing and had been changing for a while, but the architectural expressions and forms weren't necessarily changing and evolving with the evolution of society and culture until the modern era, and we started seeing modern architecture emerge. So this is the same, you can say the same thing about attire and the cars we drive, the way we communicate, literature, all of this was evolving coincidentally with architecture. So as we look at some of the architectural examples of modernism in Sherman, I want to try to frame the conversation around a few of these sort of aspects or categories. We want to talk about architectural forms. So three-dimensional shapes like masses, planes, you know, if you were thinking about like Legos or building blocks, those would be architectural forms, and the relationships between the forms. The materials and the technologies that we were being introduced to and using in the modern architecture. The relationship of the architecture to the landscape and the urban design landscape. And references, some fun references and relationships between the architecture, modern architecture here in Sherman, and the national and international architectural scene. Does anybody recognize this? David's nodding. What is it? Yes. So for those of you online that can't hear David here in the gallery, this is the Johnson, S.C. Johnson and Company headquarters building in Wisconsin, I think. And it's a very fascinating industrial complex, and the architect was Frank Lloyd Wright. His architecture, we won't go on a tangent about Frank Lloyd Wright, but this is obviously a very organic structural form that kind of feels like trees planted in an orchard. So you have the repetition of this cast in place concrete, and then it flares out to form this canopy above. And these are cast in place structural load bearing concrete columns that form this kind of open office area. Not in Sherman, but does anybody recognize that? David's also nodding again. And Ruth knows this one. What is it?
Right. The original Essen Clinic is over there by First United Bank, but then they moved here. It's across the street from Wilson and Jones.
Yes. So I think this is one of the best examples of modernist architecture in Sherman, and it's even bigger than Sherman. It's a fantastic building. So when Ruth first saw that it was in the slideshow, she asked if I remembered when it had an open canopy. If you look closely in the center of the screen, and I'll use my arrow cursor, you see this architectural form, and we're going to look more closely at it in a second. But can you start to paint a parallel between this cast in place concrete architectural form and this one? So if you're the architect and you've been commissioned to design the Essen Clinic building, and you're looking at what somebody like Frank Lloyd Wright was doing on S.C. Johnson wax, you want to play around with some of those innovative forms on your project. And there's a closer view. So I don't know, some of you watching may have experienced this building. I think it's been altered over the years. Some of these, there are several of these forms repeated. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. I don't know how many of those were open or how many were interior space. But imagine inhabiting the space underneath that. So whereas before the modern era and before the Industrial Revolution, architectural language and forms in the United States was mainly based on our European ancestry and our past. So we were reiterating classical ideas. Then we moved into Deco, which we're really not going to talk about today, and Nouveau, and now we're in this modern era where, I mean, if you had to say what does this building value, or what is it trying to say or communicate, or what is its big idea, we have to use terms like innovate and defy gravity. I mean, how is that thing staying up there like that? You know, we're using new materials in unconventional ways. We're not decorating it. We're not ornamenting it. And imagine the experience of living, moving through and working in a building like that. And this is the back of the building. There's some masonry coursing and projected coursing on this side, the back of the building, and then on the lower level, because the building is engaged in the hillside. That's also reminiscent of Frank Lloyd Wright with some of his cast block work, especially in and around Los Angeles, some of his projects there, which was based on Mayan stuff in South America. And then look, see this, that we're looking into an office that would occupy, or some kind of interior space that was underneath one of those cast forms. And this masonry work goes up and then stops. And instead of this, okay. Elizabeth is gone?
Yeah, then I'm gonna text her.
Okay, we're back. David can recognize this building. Ruth, do you know this building?
No.
This is the Via Savoie by Le Corbusier, which is a French architect, very well known. He was an academic as well as an architect that actually had realized projects, but this is considered to be one of the quintessential references for modern American residential architecture, or modern international residential architecture. And we're not going to get into much conversation about residential in this grub and gab, but I wanted to show this and then talk about this next project. Ruth, do you know this building?
That's the Sherman Police Department.
That's right. So can you see the similarities? We have a rectilinear mass elevated off the ground, raised up on pilotis, which are columns. So the architect of this building was looking at a famous international reference. At least the Villa Savoie influenced something that influenced something that influenced someone that influenced whoever drew this up. So I think it's pretty interesting that we can draw such a clear comparison between our hometown police station and this international architectural masterpiece. I think the police station is particularly interesting in the way it relates to both the street facade or the sidewalk edge and the automobile. In this case, you have a drive lane that can turn in and go underneath the upstairs form. But all in all, the similarities are pretty compelling. You have ribbon windows, pilotis, an elevated mass, some interesting breeze blocks and a planter. I understand that we have some funding to change this building dramatically. Did that not work out, David?
I don't.
Yeah, they're supposed to close that in.
Is that what they're going to do though? Because they looked at building a brand new one across town.
Right.
So, well, we did an option on that.
Yeah.
Of leaving it open. So that second floor was added in the 80s.
So that was
But it was designed to take a second floor.
right.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I remember you telling me that. I don't know, was it based on an earlier plan or was the second floor conceptualized?
Yes,
I don't know.
that's okay.
Someone try to say something?
That was Amy.
Oh,
Yeah, I'm wondering if the original drawings may have had a future concept on it, and maybe they followed that.
maybe so.
Yeah.
But I think that when they were looking at proposals for changing the exterior architecture of the building, they were trying to figure out what it wanted to look like, and they were really looking at more classical detailing. And I remember thinking at the time, and I'm not going to criticize the decision. I just want to observe the decision, because if you become more aware of the origins of some of the architectural references that we have, maybe that would be a mistake to take away this kind of reference to international modernism and make it into something else. Ruth, do you have any thoughts on that as someone outside of architecture?
So I think one of the reasons they want to close things in is because of security. So,
Well, and I get that. Like,
even the World Trade Center, which also has that open architecture, although it's glassed in, when you go into it, and there's some buildings in downtown Dallas as well, the building is actually several stories. When you go in, you're in a several story high, open architecture type environment, and then build all the offices and everything like that, even if they're closed in with glass. But, since 9/11 and the bombing before that, where they drove down in the garage, they've become very security conscious. They added the fencing around the parking lot.
right. I understand the pragmatist in you coming out and in them. So if you're going to preserve the modernist aspect of this architecture, but you want to prohibit cars with bombs from going in there, are there architectural moves that you might make to prohibit the car from going under there and increase security? Or glass? Just enclose that with glass. But if I'm going, what would you think about the concept, and you don't have to answer, just conceptualize this. What do you think about the concept of adding classical cornices, architectural brickwork, more classical detailing to a modernist building to make it look like something different in the process of making it more secure? So those are some of the issues that they were weighing.
Yeah, and I think one thing too that might have been a mistake when they were finishing the exterior is that the coloring is exactly the same top and bottom. And if they had differentiated that somehow, then you really would see that flow. Right now, they've tried to hide it.
They painted it all the same color.
That's right.
It's cast concrete on the top. There's some masonry on the bottom, which I think used to be orangish.
I think that's correct.
That's now been painted. And I think there's all kinds of cool, like, steel awnings. I can imagine, reaching out to shade these upper windows and modern stuff that you could do to actually enhance the experience of the building, but without transforming it into something else. If I start moving too fast, tell me to slow down, but we have a lot to cover in a short amount of time. So Ruth recognizes this building. This is the 320 modern building on North Travis. And I think this is one of the finest examples of modern architecture in Sherman. You can see that there are 2 levels of office suites on the upper floors. As Ruth was referring to earlier,